Hey, hello everybody. My name is Marilyn Castriata and I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Kestrel Land Trust. Thanks for joining us tonight for this webinar, Occupying Massachusetts, Layers of History on Indigenous Land, with guest speakers Sandra Matthews and David Brule. As you may know, the mission of Kestrel Land Trust is to conserve and care for forests, farms, and riverways in the Connecticut River Valley of Western Massachusetts, while nurturing and enduring love of the land. For more than 50 years, the love of the valley from people like you has given Kestrel the inspiration and ability to protect the special places you care about. Kestrel has conserved more than 27,000 acres of wildlands, woodlands, farmland, and riverlands since 1970. In doing so in partnership with willing landowners, communities, the Commonwealth, and federal agencies. Thank you for your part in helping us to do this work. Okay, now on to the webinar. As Kestrel continues to conserve land for wildlife habitat, clean water, growing local food, recreation, and as a natural solution to mitigate climate change, Indigenous perspectives on the land is a topic that we are eager to explore and understand. Occupying Massachusetts, Layers of History on Indigenous Land was just published this month, featuring photographs by Sandra of dwellings and vernacular structures found in rural Massachusetts, and texts by both David and Suzanne Gardner. The book looks closely at the human occupation of land, with an emphasis on the long presence of Indigenous people and the waves of settlement by people from other countries that began during the early 1600s and continues today. Sandra Matthews is Associate Professor Emerita of Film and Photography at Hampshire College and founding editor of the Trans-Asia Photography Review. Her photographs are in numerous public collections, including London's Victoria and Albert Museum and the Smith College Museum of Art. Sandra has also authored the photo book Present Moments, published in 2020, and co-authored a cultural history of photographs of pregnant women entitled Pregnant Pictures, published in 2000. David Brule is president of the Nolambika Project, whose mission in part is to promote a deeper, broader, and more accurate depiction of the history of the Native Americans, American Indians of the Northeast, before and during European contact and colonization. The Nolambika Project works to preserve early Indigenous sites in the Connecticut River Valley, hosts Indigenous presenters sharing their cultures and histories, and serves as a bridge between cultures and between past and future generations. David is of Nahontic, Narragansett, and Huron-Wendat descent. After their presentation, Sandra and David will answer questions. Please write your questions in the chat and I'll read them aloud. Also in the chat at the very top, you'll see a link to the Nolambika Project and ways to purchase your own copy of Occupying Massachusetts. Again, welcome Sandra and David, and welcome all of you. Thank you for your interest. And Sandra, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and thank you all so much for being here. This is wonderful to have you here. I think I can speak for both David and myself in saying that we deeply appreciate Kestrel's important work protecting many kinds of land, and equally appreciate your engagement with the land's human history. I'm honored to be presenting today alongside David Brule, who is doing really powerful healing work in relation to Indigenous history and present day culture. And I'd like to begin by inviting him to offer a land acknowledgement.
Thank you. I would say most of you, or many of you know that a protocol is fairly prevalent now where we, before events, we offer a land acknowledgement. We must acknowledge they were standing on Indigenous land for thousands of years here in the Connecticut River Valley. This has been Pocumtuck land. This is still the homelands of the Pocumtuck. They are still here. The voices are still here in the air that we breathe. They are not gone. This is still a place where three nations, Nipmuc, Abenaki, and Pocumtuck, join in very fluid coexistence. We give thanks to those first people, and we acknowledge that we're standing on and benefiting from land that is theirs and that has been taken from them. But any land acknowledgement should also contain an acknowledgement of the land and of the rivers. We've been taught by Indigenous elders that to draw our minds together at the beginning of any gathering like this, we should remember to be grateful and thankful for all that we have been given. We are thankful for this beautiful day. We give thanks to the four directions. We give thanks to all creatures who are our kinfolk and our teachers, to the rivers that nourish us. We give thanks to the last 7 generations and the next 7 generations. We are thankful and give thanks to our ancestors who have guided us and who are here with us now. We do not have to ask for anything. All this has been given to us. But we do need to learn and relearn to listen to native voices who can remind us and teach us how to live in balance and reciprocity. Acknowledgement in a sentence or a paragraph isn't enough. What will we do? Will we now include voices that were not listened to? Acknowledgement for all of us is really the first step in a long process of self-education. We are just at the beginning. This is now. We are all in this together. What will we do now with what we have been given? I usually prefer to keep that kind of acknowledgement on a spiritual level, but obviously people need to know about actions that they could take. So this is what basically we will be talking a little bit about tonight, but those of us in this part of the central Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts know all about the efforts to change the Massachusetts state flag and to support the Indigenous curriculum efforts, to support in the West here organizations that will help return land to the native nations that are here among us. So I thank you for allowing me to share this with you, and I'll have more to talk about when Sandra has finished her portion of the program. Thank you. You're muted, Sandra.
All right. Thank you very much, David, for those beautiful words. And now I will speak for about 15 minutes about the book and show slides in a few minutes. And then we'll return to David, who will talk with us about things that can be done and are being done. So David and I are broadcasting from Massachusetts here. I know some of you are in Massachusetts and some of you are in other locations, and elements of the story that we're telling can be found throughout the country. But Massachusetts in particular is often called the cradle of the American Revolution. It's the home of the Pilgrims and the Minutemen, who have been cast as heroic figures in American history. And this book, entitled Occupying Massachusetts, Layers of History on Indigenous Land, got started about 7 years ago when I was photographing architectural structures and decided to take a tour of a 17th century house in eastern Massachusetts. The tour guide spoke at length about the importance of the house in the war between the English colonists and British soldiers, and mentioned in passing that the house was located on an old Indian trail. I asked for more information about this, but the guide dismissed the question and said that nothing was known. Although I probably shouldn't have been surprised, I was shocked at this willful ignorance, this erasure of Indigenous presence, especially on the part of someone talking about history. We know that Indigenous people have been living on this continent for over 13,000 years. And according to the 2020 census, nearly 100,000 people of Indigenous descent currently live in Massachusetts. But in this historic house, it seemed that American history started with the arrival of British colonists in the 1600s, and whatever came before had been made invisible. Now I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the slides? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
All right, great. Okay. So this experience of erasure got me thinking as a photographer about the visual presence of Indigenous history in the landscape. Of course, visual presence is only one way that history is registered. We use place names derived from Indigenous language, such as Massachusetts, on a daily basis, and these names connect us to the Indigenous origins of the land. And within Indigenous communities, oral histories and traditional stories continue to be told. But I wondered what further evidence I could find with my camera, perhaps of structures that could be seen, evidence of the Indigenous history that we know is here in the midst of all the other kinds of structures that have been built on this land in the last 400 years. I was lucky to meet David Brule early in this process of exploration. David invited me to attend the community conversations he has organized, which bring together Indigenous representatives and local historians, and he may tell us something about this. And there I met people who were actively engaged in reclaiming and reframing Indigenous history and present-day culture. I began to learn, for example, about the many ancient Indigenous stone sites located throughout the state, and we see two of them here in a page spread from the book. Their locations are often kept deliberately private as a form of protection. The person who took me to the ceremonial stone grouping on the left asked me to just say in the caption that this site was on state forest land, which I did. The tunnel pictured on the right, however, is in a public park in the town of Upton. It's the entrance to a spherical stone chamber built sometime between 1300 and 1600. You can stand up in it after you enter the tunnel. You can stand up in the chamber, and when you look out from inside, the entrance is aligned with the solstice and the Pleiades at certain times of year. No one today knows the meaning of these structures, but they offer compelling visual evidence of longstanding Indigenous history. And there are a few in the book, but many, many more exist. Then, through further research and conversations, I also began to learn about the contemporary construction of traditional dwellings, such as the Wampanoag Witu on the left. These bark-covered structures also offer visual evidence of history, of the continuity of the past in the present. The two on this slide were located on the Plymouth-Patuxent Museum grounds, but similar structures can be found on tribal lands and in other places. You can see smoke from an indoor cooking fire on the left, and on the right, you can see the inner armature of a smaller Witu with benches around the perimeter. In a finished Witu, these benches are often covered in soft fur and are very comfortable. A third kind of visual evidence came from historical markers and signs in the landscape. Although the texts on most of these signs were not written by Indigenous people, they still often provide clues open to interpretation about Indigenous history. I traveled around the state finding and photographing these markers, and meanwhile, I was also continuing to photograph architecture, ordinary and not so ordinary structures built by many kinds of people over the years, all on what was originally indigenous land. These were often small-scale structures, modeling the ways that people try to create safe spaces and often don't succeed. Photographing these structures was, for me, a way of thinking about the idea of human settlement with its ironies, its complexities, and ultimately its fleetingness. People from all over the world have settled in Massachusetts, including enslaved Africans who were brought here as early as the 1630s. A large wave of Irish people who famously came in the 19th century, and many, many others, individuals and groups, including many Afghans who are arriving in Massachusetts right now. Immigration is, of course, a huge part of American history, and there are powerful stories to tell, including stories of other land thefts and dispossessions, which took place after the occupation of indigenous land. When my own parents immigrated here, one from Slovakia and the other from Hong Kong in the aftermath of World War II, they had no concept of indigenous land. They were just grateful to be in a place where they felt safer than they had been. But to the extent this country can offer a haven to people from elsewhere, that offer is tragically always built upon the foundational violent displacement of indigenous peoples, which began in the 1600s. In this book, I've tried to create a kind of double consciousness about the land by captioning each photo with both its current place name and the name of its original tribal homeland. Indigenous place names are added wherever possible. The book also includes a map, seen here, that approximates where tribal homelands were when English settlers first arrived. Thinking then about layers of history on indigenous land, this book contains photos of structures, indigenous structures and many other kinds of structures, and also photos of historical markers. A dozen carefully selected photos of historical markers are placed in the book to frame the other images with fragments of stories. These stories speak from multiple points of view about early encounters between indigenous people and European or English newcomers. Most of the signs focus on the period of time leading up to King Philip's War in 1665-1666, when the English occupation of this land, which we now call Massachusetts, became irreversible. These markers, which as objects occupy land and as texts occupy collective mental space, these markers also have their own stories. For example, 3 of the markers in the book, including this one, and the one we saw earlier, are part of a group of almost 300 cast iron signs installed throughout the state in 1930 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the founding in 1630 of Massachusetts Bay Colony. When I looked up Massachusetts Bay Colony, please bear with me, I want to just tell you a little bit about it. I found out that it was a project of the Massachusetts Bay Company, a commercial joint stock company chartered by the King of England in 1630 to settle and economically develop this part of the New World, using the Christian doctrine of discovery as justification. The settlers recruited for the colony held shares in the company, and within 3 decades, so many settlers had been recruited that the English population vastly overwhelmed the numbers of indigenous people in the area. As a commercial venture, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had no problem with slavery. They participated in the African slave trade, and in addition, under their auspices, large numbers of indigenous people living in the Northeast were captured and sold into slavery in the West Indies and other places. Others were converted to Christianity and moved into English-style praying towns, such as Natick, pictured here. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a theocracy run by Puritans who actively persecuted Baptists, Quakers, Catholics, and many others. So is the 300th anniversary of the Massachusetts Bay Colony really worthy of celebration? The Massachusetts Bay Colony Tercentenary Commission thought so, and in 1930, they decided to make these almost 300 signs, most of which are still in place. and hired Harvard history professor Samuel Eliot Morison to write the texts. The texts on the signs were intended to inspire patriotism, specifically to, quote, rekindle in us a veneration for the pioneers of a new country, end quote. Some of the signs are quite informative, but many are in serious need of new language. I had an experience that surprised me in 2019 when I photographed this sign you see here, which is near my home. It reads, Hatfield, before 1870 part of Hadley, thrice attacked by Indians during King Philip's War. Well, this may seem in some ways like a simple statement of facts in quaint language. Some additional information is clearly needed. The English residents of Hatfield were not just passive victims. King Philip's War was the war in which the English took decisive military control of the area. I went back the next day to take more pictures of the sign and found that it had disappeared overnight. It turned out a number of the signs were being removed by the state and refurbished, of course at taxpayer expense. A few months later, a shiny new version appeared. There was no new information, no recontextualization. All that had happened was the cleaning, repainting, and reinstalling of an outdated and misleading view of state history, complete with our offensive state seal at the top. All of these markers have the state seal at the top. Thankfully, the seal is soon to be replaced, but this will make the signs even more outdated. And if you don't know, our state seal depicts in shiny gold here an anonymous Indigenous man holding a bow and arrows pointing down with an arm wielding a sword above his head. The decision to refurbish these old signs without any change or without any new information was made just 3 years ago in 2019. I wonder if it was made out of a purist notion of historic preservation, preserve these signs no matter what they say, or if it had some other political motive. In any case, the refurbished signs stand as a powerful example of the remarkable staying power of problematic narratives. In contrast, there's a stone marker by the Connecticut River in Gill, Massachusetts, which commemorates a large massacre of Native people there. It was originally installed in 1900 by the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association, and it's written with blunt and disturbing language. You can see traces of red spray paint from one of the many protests directed at this marker. Currently, the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association is in active conversation with local Indigenous groups and others about how best to use this marker and make it an opportunity to talk more fully about history. It would have been great if the State Department of Transportation, which refurbished the tercentenary signs we just saw, had taken a similar attitude. Among the dozen in the markers in the book, there are two very important signs which were installed in Plymouth in 1998 by a group called United American Indians of New England, which continues to be a very active organization. Native activism has not often taken the form of installing historical signs, and these two signs are rare and very powerful. One of them describes the grisly dismemberment by the English of the Wampanoag leader Metacomet, also known as King Philip. And the other talks about the National Day of Mourning, a tradition which was initiated by the United American Indians of New England. This marker reads, since 1970, Native Americans have gathered at noon on Coles Hill in Plymouth to commemorate a National Day of Mourning on the US Thanksgiving holiday. Many Native Americans do not celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims and other European settlers. To them, Thanksgiving is a reminder of the genocide of millions of their people, the theft of their lands, and the relentless assault on their culture. Participants in National Day of Mourning honor Native ancestors and the struggles of Native people today. It is a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest of the racism and oppression which Native Americans continue to experience. This marker has been installed at the top of a hill just above Plymouth Rock, the mythical landing place of the Pilgrims. It offers an alternative narrative to the more traditional story of settler heroism. This plaque and the Day of Mourning itself were the result of years of intensive political negotiation with the town of Plymouth by Indigenous activists and allies. The Day of Mourning continues to be a vibrant gathering that takes place each November, and it can be attended virtually as well. We all have bodies. We all need to occupy space and land in order to live. Occupation happens. This book is about the contemporary occupation of land through the building of structures and the telling of histories. While it acknowledges that many different people occupy Massachusetts for many reasons, it keeps returning to the formative, forcible occupation of Indigenous land, which began in the 1600s, and to the ways stories of that occupation are told. This is not a polemical book. It doesn't provide any answers. It aims to raise questions and to stimulate a subtle shift in awareness for the reader. For me, traveling around the state, making photos and learning bits and pieces of many difficult histories has deepened my engagement with the place in which I live. It's also given me the opportunity to meet remarkable people like David Brule. In addition to writing a beautiful essay for the book, David was a sage advisor throughout this project. And I'll now stop sharing so that he can speak to you.
So thank you, Sandra. I hope my voice is coming across all right. It seems like I get a little feedback here, but let me know. So I'm really grateful to have been invited by Sandra to share some information, but also to participate in this book. And my simple contribution isn't other than behind the scenes working with Sandra, is basically my contribution of an essay that I tried to base in reality. That is, I called it Occupying Indigenous Land, Finding a Way Forward. For those of you, and I recognize a number of people who are attending, for those of you who have taken an active role in finding a way forward, you all, and I'll share with the others, you all know it's quite challenging and quite fraught. I don't want to offer up a naive perspective, because I think it's going to be a long time coming to find some healing. The people that I've worked with, and I'll share a little bit about that particular event and way of doing things, has taught me a number of things. One is that the way I wrote it in my essay is that the pain is very great. The injury has not healed, and the multi-generational trauma of what has gone before, right up until almost modern times, it continues and is passed on. The people that we worked with in the effort that I'll share in a second share that. They in some cases, they don't know why, but it's there. There's a lot of trauma. So my perspective is that we all, if we're interested in finding a way forward, we pretty much would work on an individual basis, although there are some great efforts now, as I mentioned, and that Sandra mentioned about the changing the state seal and having a frameworks, Massachusetts public school frameworks that represents Indigenous Americans. But in my case, coming from a background of mixed Indigenous ancestry, I did a lot of learning, and I met a lot of people who were very helpful. So in my case, and in the case of a lot of people that I've been working with, it came down to a convergence of individuals and great opportunity. So the background for what I'm about to share is known to some and unknown to others, and that is Sandra showed us the stone monument that celebrated the attack by William Turner's group and the slaughter of 300 natives right at the falls in what is now known, ironically, as Turner's Falls. So that, in our opinion, and those of us who know and those of us who live there and those tribal people whose ancestors and family connections go back to that day, felt that this was quite underreported. And by a stroke of luck, we had a chance to apply to the National Park Service for a grant to study this battlefield, which was a little bit perplexing at the beginning for the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program, because they had not often dealt with Indigenous American battlefields. They deal with Revolutionary War battlefields, Civil War battlefields. We were one of the first two to ever take up this challenge. And so we applied to the National Park Service for a grant to study the massacre at the falls of May 19, 1676. And as I said, the convergence was magical. We had developed over the years, myself personally and the Nolambika Project had developed over the years a number of personal contacts with the Aquinnah Wampanoag people, with the Narragansett Deputy Historic Preservation Officer, with the Abenaki from the region around Brattleboro, and the Nipmuc people from central Massachusetts. So we set out to accomplish this grant, and it was awarded to us. And the governing board was to be an advisory board. We developed an advisory board with these 4 tribes I mentioned, and 5 historical commissioners from the area region where the attack, approach, and retreat had taken place. So that was a kind of a magical combination, because we had, and now we're in our 10th year, we had monthly meetings with these 5 non-tribal people, basically appointed by their municipalities under Massachusetts general law to oversee historical projects in their towns, and the 4 to 5 native people representing their tribal communities. So we all sat together once a month for now towards the end of our 9th year. We hired an anthropologist, archaeologist to do the research, and we began finding and hearing data. The people were, especially the native tribes, were their role was to be in the field with the archaeologist and to look over his shoulder, her shoulder, and comment, advise, caution, you name it. So this is one of those things that brought tribal and non-tribal people together. And I think the magic happened because we were not doing an explicit effort at truth and reconciliation. It was more like getting at what happened that day, what really happened at the falls. And that was, again, one of those things that really was very important, because we were not trying to assess blame. It was more trying to find out what happened, trying to interpret, use all of our various perspectives and that. So that's essentially what I have written about in my essay. The point being that I think of all the efforts that I'm not an organizer. I'm not somebody who gets into political demonstrations, and that's not my nature, but I do come to these projects with a sense of humility and candidness. And I think that has helped me anyway, and has helped the tribal people that we work with feel that we are making an effort to get at some of the truth and to find a way forward. And that's happened. People have got to know each other. We have begun other projects together. So what I call this is, for me and for some of us who are working at this, is almost like seeking a separate peace. The wounds of what has happened for the last 400 years are going to be really deep and are going to take quite a while. The way I closed my essay is basically saying the occupation of Massachusetts will never end. There's no going back. The wounds of tribal people are deep and may never be completely healed. But we have to find a way forward. What do we do? As I said in my land acknowledgement, what will we do with the situation we have been given? I think that in efforts where the tribal communities and non-tribal communities get a chance to get together and to work together, to work on a project like the study of this massacre is incredibly important. I know that there are among people listening and attending that you have familiarity with efforts to return land to the native people, to the communities. And I think that's a possibility, although I think we all have realized that it's quite fraught also. To what community do return land? And are there entities that feel comfortable in receiving land, or how do you do that? So those are the kinds of efforts I think that are happening now, and they're all very laudable. But I'd go back to my own little example of simply sitting down at the table and working on something that does not explicitly try to find a way to excuse what happened, but more to find a way forward. The Nolambika project itself, we have one of our other principal efforts, in addition to this battlefield study, which I chair, but not as a Nolambika person, but we have this, the Nolambika Pukamtuk Homelands Festival, music festival, every year on the shores facing where the massacre happened. And it is an intertribal, intercommunity effort. Musicians come, we all sing, we all dance, we all listen to wisdom of the elders. Those beautiful, deep, big drums sounding along the shores and up through the village named for the person who led the massacre is incredibly important. And those are the types of things that are really important, I think. It's the type of thing I can do in my own way to be a part of. If others find other ways, I think it's incredibly important. Those of you who are skilled at writing and leading movements and getting petitions out to change the seal, to push for Indigenous curriculum in the schools, etc. I think each of us has a challenge to try to at least help find a way forward. So that's what I've spent the last 20 years of my life trying to do. So thank you for listening. I hope I was able to give you a little glimpse into what we've accomplished at this place where the name of Turner, the person who perpetrated the massacre, this place, we're working on healing. I will end with a quote from a good friend, Elizabeth James Perry, the Aquinnah Wampanoag representative to our board. And basically she said, as a case in point, I'd like to think that the memory of this place, this falls, this massacre is being re-examined for a reason. Working to preserve the site has brought Northeastern tribal descendants and townspeople together. As long as we treat the people who perished here, the 300 natives, elderly, women and children, as long as we treat them with the dignity and respect they didn't receive in life, we will be making some advances towards healing. I always like to quote Elizabeth's words because that's what this is all about. It's finding a way forward, finding how to heal something that is deep and painful, but we can't go back. So thank you for listening to me, and Sandra and I will surely be glad to field some questions if you have any.
Thank you both, Sandra and David, for your wonderful presentations. And yes, if anybody has a question, please write it in the chat and I will be glad to read it out loud for Sandra and David to address. Here's a question. Would David be willing to tell us a bit about the purchase of the
Wissatinawag.
Yes, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
Property in Greenfield.
Sure. I'd be glad to. So the hill, the ridgeline overlooking the falls, is the site of a 10,000-year-old village that was peopled by the Macomtuck tribal people. The falls are a very magical place. Indigenous people came from all over to fish there, but also our Connecticut River Valley is so fertile that the quality of corn grown here in the valley had reached as far as the Ohio River Valley and certainly up towards the St. Lawrence River Valley. So it occurred that after the massacre, that village on the top of the hill, if you cross the Turner's Falls Gill Bridge, let's say coming from Gill into the village, to your right is a tremendous long ridgeline that reaches down to what's called Poet's Seat Tower. Anyway, at the top of that ridgeline was a village. The village was deserted after the massacre at the foot of that ridgeline. Sometime in the 1950s, a local sand and gravel operation determined that that was a site that would be great to mine for fill to use in construction. And so they began doing that. And doing that, they began digging into a burial ground where hundreds of burials over the 10,000 years were and still are. It was not illegal to dig out human remains, Native American remains, and that's what happened. Burial goods, bones, entire skeletons were dug out, tossed into a dump truck, and put into a general fill and used under the highway that people still drive over. So at some point, as the in the 90s, when the federal government got active in protecting Native American burial grounds, there was a movement to prevent the Sand and Gravel Company from doing that, which was fine. So it was stopped. The removal of human remains was stopped. And then that company, realizing they could no longer get sand and gravel out of there, decided that they would probably sell the land to Walmart, which would have been the end and the destruction of that village site and of course the graves. So a group called the Friends of Wissatinawag got together and formed a nonprofit and began, you name it, bake sales, demonstrations, fundraising, and eventually we were able to purchase the land out from under Walmart, which was a tremendous victory. So we now, the Nolambika project, with a lot of help from the tribes I mentioned, was able to purchase the land. We got help from some very important donors. And at this stage, we now are stewards of 40 acres of land. The burials are now protected in perpetuity. And myself and other members of our board bring groups, the local historical societies, you name it, and any number of local school children to the group, and we interpret that site both from points of view of archaeology, history, the healing that's taking place on just nature taking over the landscape and bringing back the site from what looked like a moonscape 15 years ago. So I hope that covers it. I didn't want to take too much time, but thank you for the question. It's an active project, and we are really making certain that people know the story.
Thank you, David. So pleased to hear that that area was conserved in perpetuity. Okay, here's another question. What can be done to hold the state accountable for using public funds on the refurbishment of the, quote, 300-year signs at a time when the state seal is being addressed? And also added to this question, the cost of refurbishing installed signs was an excuse given for not addressing the state seal earlier over the 36-year lobbying effort.
I can leave that to Sandra perhaps, and then jump in as you like, or it's up whichever would like. Sandra, do you feel comfortable with that?
I can get started. I think the commission that's currently working on the new state seal actually started after 2019. I believe it was 2021 that it was established, that commission. So I didn't know that the cost of refurbishing was an excuse for not addressing the state seal earlier. That's interesting. Good question. I mean, it's in the past now. Maybe there, but if people are moved to address that, I guess the usual means of contacting our representatives are a place to begin. But I don't have any practical suggestions. But it is there are lots of ironies there with the things that are happening simultaneously, and I'm glad to know that that was used as an excuse. Do you have anything else to add, David?
Sure. I'll jump in just as many of us are educators. I'll take a case in point of that stone monument and then get to the other signs. The stone monument in Gill in Riverside has long been a thorn in all of our sides. And as Sandra alluded to, typically on the night of May 18th to 19th, usually there is some kind of symbolic attack on that monument, either paint, or this past year there was a garbage bag put over it and everything was covered up. What the Battlefield Advisory Board, that is the 4 tribes and the 5 communities, we are seeking a way to have alternative signage near that site. And I think we're making really good progress. It belongs to the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association, and they could be interested in having us provide additional signage that would further interpret what the atrocity was. as opposed to the brief celebratory announcement of the destruction of 300 Indians. So I mentioned education. Many historians that I work with, and I think that's my own feeling too, is that rather than destroying all this, the tercentenary signage, further interpretive signage is needed. It's good to see where the heads were 100 years ago, but what about where we are now? So there are a good number of people seeking more, like finding a way to add further signage that would in some way counterbalance, but certainly inform people who are passing by of the actual case alluded to in those stone markings. But certainly the one in Gillen Riverside is definitely going to happen. Something is going to be done there. There's a lot of movement, and I think but that's, again, it's going back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of us on the individual level can do things. We can challenge the state, but the state moves so slowly, and it's often, as you know, depending on who's in the office. We've got some momentum about the state seal, and we've got momentum about the curriculum. And so I'm hoping that the same could happen with this signage. There's a whole lot of backstory about all those signs that we could get into at some point, but everybody is, our people that I work with have got their eye on those signs, and definitely on that horrific stone monument in Riverside.
Thank you, David and Sandra. Thank you for your question, Karen. Annie asks, if I were looking for someone to verify a place of suspicion in the greater Boston area, who could I contact?
What is a place of suspicion?
Annie, would you like to clarify? But in the meantime, if Annie, you can put your
Sure.
oh,
Let's see. So I live very close to an area, a conservation area, that I believe is filled with serpentine walls and other ceremonial stone effigies, I guess, and a cairn and burial grounds. And nobody seems to know anything about it. Everybody thinks that the serpentine walls were left there by English farmers. And I know from growing up in Jamaica that the English made very solid vertical and horizontal walls, and they would punch you in the face if you said that those walls were built by them.
Well, David, would Doug Harris still be the person to contact?
I understand that Doug Harris isn't well,
Mhm.
and he has put me in touch with somebody who lives in my town. But once again, she has exposed to me the danger of publicizing these sites and of poking around and making inquiries, because there's a lot of racism.
Yeah, it's a challenging question. Yeah, hats off to Doug Harris, who has done a tremendous amount of a lifetime work on this. But he is retired, but he will be I think active. He's been working with us for a long time here at the Falls. So you yourself are in the Boston area, right? Is that what I'm understanding? Yeah.
Yes, I live west of Boston.
Yeah.
Near the Sudbury River.
Okay. Yeah. So myself, I am the whole concept of ceremonial stone landscapes is still being what would I say? There are other people here who are more in tune with this, although I've been out with Doug quite a bit and seen the material, but you know what you're up against. And when we first started out, people like Mr. Harris were not given permission by the tribal councils to talk about the locations or anything about it because of the fear of vandalism. The other issue, though, is it's out of my my region, so I don't know people out that way. I do know that it should be in the vicinity of the Wampanoag territory, but not all tribal people are sure of what these stone groupings are either. And as Doug famously said, there's not enough Indians to go around to get out to all these sites. So it's a tall order. The only thing, again, you as an individual, I think you have to seek some way to protect that. What was I about to say? Are you anywhere in Newton? Anywhere near Newton, Mass, there is on October 10th a celebration where many tribes from the eastern part of Massachusetts will be attending. So that's one possibility of, and I know the tribal historic preservation offices of the Wampanoag and of the Mashpee people, I mean, who knows if they have the time or the ability to respond. So that's about as far as I can take it.
Thanks for your question and your clarification, Annie. Here's a question. How do you go about finding clues to what happened from something that occurred so long ago?
So that sounds like a question for me. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating. I could talk for the next hour and a half about it because when we hired the archaeologists in 2014, as you know, those of you who have worked in towns where there are construction projects, the proponent has to do a data search. So the first round was the anthropologists going to all the sources they could possibly find, including something as basic as the local libraries, but then going to the military records of Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts. Then so they pulled all of this documentation together, which is absolutely fascinating and can be found on the Town of Montague website. There's 2 reports of 300 pages each, and it is the definitive study of that, what they call the Falls Fight, what we call a massacre. The other fascinating part of the story is that because it was an American battlefield protection site, the feds were interested in battlefield artifacts. They were not obviously going to be having us look for arrowheads or mortar and pestles, or they wanted musket balls. So hard evidence. The team over the last 2, not consecutive, but the last 2 summers, have turned up more than 600 musket balls in that vicinity. Now, these people are expert in analyzing military terrain, and they have done this before in studying the Mystic Fort massacre and out west in various other battlefields. So that's one clue. They located all these musket balls and some horse tack and other domestic goods, and then they took them to the lab at the Pequot Museum and then later at UConn and began analyzing. They could tell what kind of rifle it was fired from, which let's say a military unit would have had it. They have analyzed the lead content and surmised where all those sources. So a tremendous amount of information, the direction from which the musket ball was fired. So interpreting all of this, we've had some incredible information and a whole new perspective on what happened at that massacre, because it was really, yes, the colonials did massacre 300 elderly non-combatants, women and children, but they did suffer almost close to 45% casualties in their retreat, which is a total rout. And so what we have been doing over the summer is tracing that retreat route and interpreting what happened. So there's it's a specialty, but I've learned a lot by trailing around with the archaeologists, and then with the 4 tribes and the 5 towns sitting at the table every month, poring over the information. We've developed a real interesting story of what I call what really happened at the falls. I hope that begins to answer the question.
Wow, thank you, David. That's good to hear that work is being done. There have been a couple questions in the chat regarding books. If anybody wants to scroll up to the very top of the chat, before we began, I put in some links just as a reminder for anybody who might have joined later. There's a link to the Nolambika project. There's a link to order books directly, as well as the publisher's website. And then also there are 2 bookstores here in Western Mass, Broadside Bookshop and Amherst Books, who currently have copies.
Marilyn, let me just add that
Okay.
those copies have just come in. So people were experiencing this kind of back order, and there was some kind of a log jam, and it seems to be breaking. So if you have been told that it's back ordered, please try again tomorrow, and it might be there, because that's what's been happening locally. It's just sort of they're just coming in now. So please be patient.
Okay, great. And someone said that those links weren't there, so I am going to now repost. So there you go at the bottom of the chat. Here's another question. Thank you, Dana. In seeking guidance for land acknowledgements, I've reached out to Indigenous communities forcibly removed from land my organization currently uses. I've connected with the Nipmuc Nation and Mohegan Nation, but cannot find anyone from the Wakamtuk Nation to verify how they wish to be acknowledged. Can David or Sandra offer someone I might reach out to? In particular, I believe 2 of the properties we use were ancestral homelands of both Nipmuc and Wakamtuk. These are South Hadley and Holyoke towns.
Sure, I'll jump in on that. And it's the unfortunate part of the history of this valley is that shortly after the massacre at the falls and the kind of winding down of the King Philip's War, the Wakamtuk left the area. So they sought refuge in among the Stockbridge Munsee Mohicans and among the Abenaki in the St. Lawrence River Valley. So there are records of the Wakamtuk coming back, especially I like to relate the story about the 1704 raid in Deerfield. People in this region don't particularly always think to link the King Philip's War with the succeeding French and Indian wars that started in 1700. But the Wakamtuk who did survive oftentimes blended into the Abenaki or the Abenaki, as the Abenaki prefer to be called. So the Wakamtuk Nation itself, to my knowledge, does not have a physical presence any longer. There may be people who claim to be Wakamtuk descendants. During the battlefield study in the last 10 years, we have not found anybody who would come forward to represent the Wakamtuk people. The closest are the Nipmuc. The Nipmuc, we have many deeds up and down the valley, and the names are basically, the place names are what is recognized as Nipmuc. So my sense is, so you have two Nipmuc communities, right? And the one is the Nipmuc Nation has basically sort of dissolved and now has become the Hassanamesko band and the Chabonagungamog band. So those people are currently the ones who I think would be the most authorized to speak for the Pocumtuck. I don't like to use the word extinct, but that's not the case. On the other hand, the Okateo people in Ashfield are Nipmuc, and Andre Strong Bearheart Gaines and Larry Spotted Crow Mann are incredible sources of information, and they also, along with the Abenaki, Marge Bruchac and other notable scholars, feel that they, because the Pocumtuck went and blended in with the Abenaki, they feel also that they have some say in the representing the Pocumtuck who are scattered. That's why you wouldn't have heard anything back from the Pocumtuck.
Wow, thank you, David. You are a wellspring of information. It's tremendous. It's good to be learning this together. Here's a question from Mark. What do we know about a site in Springfield called King Philip's Stockade? Is it historically significant?
Sandra, should I take that?
Please.
Anything you're familiar with? Yeah. I'll have to say that I'm not familiar with the site. I don't have any recollection or record of King Philip having been active in Springfield. There is a sizable Nipmuc community, slightly under the radar there, but the person I mentioned, Andre Strong Bearheart Gaines, who works out of the Okateo Center in Ashfield, has resided in Springfield, and he would be a great source. One of the things that we discovered in doing the study about King Philip, though, and King Philip's War, is that King Philip was not really a warrior. He was a diplomat, and he was a person who was out locating sources of munitions and supplies. So it's ironic that they would call this particular war King Philip's War, because of course he was perhaps at the beginning of it, but he was not somebody who was in the field all the time. There are significant Narragansett and Nipmuc warriors who should be known. Whenever I do a presentation, I always have a list prominent on an easel saying, we should remember these people who defended their homelands, and they're men leaders as well as very strong women, what are called sunk squaw, women leaders, warrior leaders. Philip was not a warrior. He was, as I said, a diplomat. He was an organizer. He tried to hold things together. But so if there is a King Philip's Fort in Springfield, which normally would have been the homelands of the Agawam, so be it. But it's kind of like King Philip slept here, George Washington slept here. Maybe yes, maybe no. But that's where that comes from. So I'm sure if there is oral history about that, then surely it was an Indian fort. And more than likely in the Longmeadow and Springfield area, it would have been the Agawam, who were associated with the Pocumtuck Nation. So all those towns down the river, the Nonotuck, Norwottuck, Waranoco, and Agawam, they were all part of the broader spectrum of the Pocumtuck, which some people call Federation.
Okay, let's see. just got another question in here. Thank you again for your very informative answer to that question. Here's a question from Elisa on a different subject, if that's okay. What is known about the normal daily life of the people who lived here before the Europeans started invading?
Well, I'll field that. I would say very little. Native people didn't write it down. Whatever was written by European observers with more than likely some prejudice. On the other hand, especially among what I have knowledge of is the Nipmuc. There was plenty of oral history. People again like Andre that I keep quoting, but he is a rising star among the Nipmuc people. Young man, very dynamic, does a lot of public speaking and is very active. So they know a good part of their cultural, what they have inherited. Sometimes it's through oral history, sometimes it's through research, or just putting two and two together. Andre and Larry Spotted Crow are great sources of information. They are people who, unlike some of the people in the two Nipmuc communities, they are out there. They're out talking and being engaged and sharing their culture and their history. And they work with the Pocumtuck Homelands Festival. A case in point is that Andre launched a dugout this year with us, and he did that by traditional burning out these logs by that means. So there's a book that I participated in that was a book on Riverside, where I have a number of let's say pages about the daily life of Native people as told to me by some informants in the valley here.
Like you also mentioned Jennifer Lee and Marge Bruchak, who both have really researched early ways of life and sometimes present them publicly.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. If everybody wants to look at the chat, Karen said, posted that as a member of the Land Justice Affinity Group, she has learned of a historical deeds document that people on this call may be interested in. And you can click on that link. Are there any remaining questions that anybody would like to ask Sandra and David? Well, this has certainly been a rich presentation and conversation. We are so grateful, Sandra and David, for your work and your presentation and for all that you shared. We're so thankful for all the participants. Thank you, everybody, for your interest and joining us tonight. If you have a question that comes to you after the meeting ends, you're certainly welcome to email me, and I can forward those to Sandra and David and connect you with them. As we know, there's so much work to be done, and there's so much good work being done, and we're just so thankful for this great turnout and this great work that the two of you are doing.
And thank you to Kestrel for hosting.
Yes, great work also. Yes, excellent.